Welcome everybody, and welcome back to the second lecture in our series on imperialism. Last time we took a look at the global state of imperialism at the end of the 19th century. We saw major countries like Germany going out there getting vast empires that covered the entire globe, carving up many of those more populated but much poorer, weaker nations that became colonies. We ended by taking a look at the American takeover in Hawaii, and we saw that the coup that took place there, the overthrow of the Hawaiian government, led to America annexing Hawaii to become a territory and later a state many decades later. Today we are going to look at the one of the largest land grabs in U.S. history. We're going to look at the Spanish-American War and the resulting empire that it created for the United States. So let's go ahead and jump into it. And again, the main focus today is going to be on the Spanish-American War. It's not a war that gets talked about too often. It is not really remembered as well as some of the more recent wars, but tremendous impact on the United States, both in the nation that we would become, but also really some change in our norms and change in, frankly, our morals, change in our focus when we have to start defending an empire. And we're going to see ourselves go down a path that America had never gone down before. So I want to begin by taking a look at the history of Spain. They will be our antagonists during this lecture. At its height, the Spanish Empire was one of the largest in the world. You can see from this map, everything in red belonged to the Spanish Empire. Most of the New World belonged to the Spanish Empire at one point. But they were very early on the empire game. You know, Columbus sailed under a Spanish banner, and so when they claimed most of the territory in this new world for Spain, they were able to plunder a lot of the resources early on, and they set up governments and bureaucracies over here in their colonies. But by the time we're getting to the late 19th century, the late 1800s, what we start to see is that the Spanish Empire is crumbling. Okay, they have lost control of most of their territory in the Western Hemisphere by the early 1800s. Almost all those nations in the Western Hemisphere would have declared independence and fought for that independence. And so really by the time we're talking about, even by 1825, the only part that Spain still controls are the Philippines, which is a vast set of islands, Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then some parts of Africa. So in particular, we're going to begin by talking about Cuba. Cuba is going to be where the story kind of centralizes, at least in the first part. And I will tell you that this war is fought really in two theaters, and one of those theaters is Cuba. The history of Spain and their involvement in Cuba, they had held on to Cuba. It was one of the first places that Columbus landed, 1511. It was a colonial possession, officially a colonial possession from 1511 on. Cubans did fight to become independent around the same time we were fighting our Civil War, a little bit after that. And, while they weren't able to claim independence, they were able to get some progress, including the emancipation of slaves and abolition. So Cuba was not independent, but they had fought to end slavery in that country. Now, American interactions in Cuba, much like what we saw in Hawaii with the emphasis on sugar, in particular, once the slaves are freed from Cuba, Americans' investment in Cuban sugar does skyrocket. We talked about in our last lecture that 1884 tariff, and basically we ended that tariff on Cuban sugar, and it really helped boost trade with that island. By 1894, we reinstated that tariff, and basically the economy that had been built up with this trade with the United States is all of a sudden comes crashing down. So, this is the same story throughout history. Anytime you have major economic struggle, it is often followed by political struggle. So we're going to see a lot of political instability as a result of American tariffs, basically destroying the economy of Cuba. There were certain voices that began calling for Cuban independence, and one of those was a newspaper turned political activist named Jose Marti. His famous motto, Cuba Libre, free Cuba. He really became the voice of the Cuban people during this time, and like I said, he would push for independence. It's around this period, though, that we're starting to see the Cubans fight against the Spanish authorities there. And they're using guerrilla tactics in order for, this fight for independence to begin. And, this is not the first time we've seen guerrilla warfare, but it would become increasingly common as we get into the 20th century, of course. But when you have small bands of local fighters attacking by surprise using non-conventional military tactics. That's a lot of fancy words. Really what it means is it's not the conventional warfare that you're used to. Large battles with major armies marching towards each other. You don't see that here. It's more like what you would see when the United States invaded Vietnam, or frankly what you would see when the United States went into Iraq. You have small groups that are trying to isolate, soldiers that are attacking with, bombs, and it's not that large scale battle that you may be thinking of, but it's very frustrating. And if you're Spain, it's a very difficult thing to fight against. That's the problem with guerrilla war, is it often works. Well, the Spanish are going to react pretty swiftly and decisively. They send down one of their more important generals down. His name is General Weyler, and he is going to attempt to restore order. Now, the way he does that is really by putting the hammer down, and anybody that is even assumed to be one of these rebels is going to be thrown into what amounts to a concentration camp. And, I don't use that word lightly, but it fits every definition here. Now, it would not necessarily be the planned extermination camps that we would see in the Holocaust, but what happens is when you shove 300,000 people behind, gates, there's often poor sanitation, there's lack of water, lack of food, and what ends up happening is that thousands of Cubans end up dying in this, many of which were completely innocent. Now, Americans are watching this, okay, and, this is something that is gaining more and more steam in the newspapers, and, the newspapers are really kind of controlling the message. That's going to be a big part of what we're going to discuss. So the reason I include this kind of as the background to the Spanish-American War is because Americans are watching this, and they're reading about it in the newspapers, and they're becoming increasingly frustrated at what they see as, Spain, increasing the violent tyranny on these poor Cubans. So this attack on Cubans by General Weyler is what I call strike one, okay, and kind of the old baseball cliche, 3 strikes and you're out. This is strike one, the Spanish brutality in Cuba, okay, the first strike. Now, one thing that made it even worse, it was terrible on the ground, but one thing that made it worse was the propaganda that was being pushed out by 2 of the leading newspapermen in the country. William Randolph Hearst, who had one of the nation's largest newspapers, the New York Journal, and then you also had on the other side Joseph Pulitzer, and he would have one of the other most popular newspapers in the country, and that was the New York World. Both of these men understood that the more grandioso headline that you could publish, the more violence that you could include, it would get people to buy the papers. The same principle works today. You hear of clickbaits, right? If they can just get you to click on that link when you're browsing online, then all of a sudden you're looking at their advertisements. They're making money off it. It's the exact same thing today. So, a headline that kind of grabs your attention, but, it may not be truthful. It may not be accurate, but it gets you to click. And in this case, it gets you to buy a newspaper, and that was their goal. This is what we call yellow journalism, okay? We see this today. Frankly, we often call it fake news, clickbait, whatever you want to call it. But yellow journalism is this term that was applied to the period in which they were sending journalists down to document the events, but they were twisting those events, and they were making, in many cases, them seem worse than they actually were. In particular, some of the violence that they were reporting. In some cases, it didn't even happen. They were talking about major battles didn't even occur. So they're trying to sell newspapers. That is the ultimate goal, and they don't care if they're accurate in how they portray these events. And so again, much like what has been dubbed fake news. Sometimes that term gets applied to real news, but in this case, what they were doing was exaggerating the truth, and they were doing it on purpose to try and create the more amazing headline to get people to buy their newspapers. A great quote from William Randolph Hearst. He actually sent a journalist down who wired back a message that said, "Listen, there's really not much going on down here. What do you want me to do?" And he replied back, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." All right, so just send pictures of anything you can find, and I'll make sure that this fervor increases. So again, the goal of yellow journalism is not the truth. The goal is to sell more newspapers. Strike two. In 1898, the Spanish ambassador to the United States is caught in a private letter in which he is heavily critical of the President of the United States, William McKinley. He calls him weak and cowardly. Now, today this may not seem like that big of a deal. You get on Twitter and you see 1,000 times worse said about whoever the president is at the time. But at this time, it was quite insulting to have a politician, not just a politician, but one from Spain, right? Spain, they're the bad guys in this story, right? They're the ones that we need to be critical of because they're doing, look at all this violence they're bestowing upon these poor Cubans. But for them to be critical of us, that for a lot of Americans created even more resentment of not just the Spanish military on the ground in Cuba, but also the Spanish government. They're trying to bring us in about regarding this, and they just a lot of Americans were quite upset by that, and this is kind of the second. It was more insulting than anything, but this would serve as kind of that next critical stage of, okay, now wait a second. The Spanish government needs to step back. If this ambassador is saying this kind of stuff, imagine, what else is being said. And then the critical strike three, and by far this is the biggest of all of the causes of the Spanish-American War, and that is the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, in 1898, William McKinley will order the USS Maine, one of those new naval vessels we talked about. He will order the USS Maine to Havana, Cuba, in order to protect American assets there. They are not there to attack the Cubans, not there to attack the Spanish. They are there simply to defend any Americans on the islands if they need a place for safe haven if things get too violent. In February of 1898, as the USS Maine is floating in the Havana harbor there, in the middle of the night, the ship will explode. I mean, it is cut in two. And on board are 350 Americans. And with this blast, such a powerful blast, about 260 of them would die almost immediately. A horrible tragedy, that the ship blew up and all these Americans are dead. Now, if you are living at the time, and again, you got to think, every day you've been reading these headlines about Spain, the enemy, Spanish this, Spanish that, you automatically assume that the Spanish have attacked us, right? I mean, it makes sense. You would think, like, it's not going to be the Cubans who would do this. It's got to be the Spanish. In fact, look at some of these headlines that we see. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. By the way, that'll be wrong. $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrators. Even the Secretary, Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who's going to get involved here, said that it was not an accident. Some would even say that, the Spaniards involved in well, fast forward to 1976, okay? 70 plus years after these events, submarine technology has gotten to the point where we can actually go down and we could study the wreckage of the USS Maine and try to identify exactly what kind of weapon had attacked us. And it turns out that nothing had attacked us. In fact, the warship Maine blew up on its own accord. The most common theory that we often see is that the way these ships were designed, and again, they ran on steam power, which that steam was created through firing coal. Okay, so they had these large coal rooms that they would shovel the coal out of to power the ship. At the time, they were storing this coal in the bottom of the ship, right next to the ammunition. All right? Now, coal has a very unique property that sometimes it has been known to combust on its own, especially with lack of oxygen, things like that. It can combust and it can catch fire. What historians, one theory as to how the USS Maine blew up was that coal room caught fire in the middle of the night without anyone knowing, and that fire spread to the ammunition room, which of course exploded. Now, from the perspective of someone off the ship, the Maine exploded on its own, from a bomb or whatever it may be, that the Maine was attacked, but as we can see here, we have no reason to expect that the Maine was attacked in any way. This was something it was an accident. Now, again, the average reader in America who has been reading these sensational headlines every day about how horrible the Spanish are, do you think that they are going to accept, maybe we need to slow down, maybe we need to think about whether this was... Of course not. They are going to call for, they want blood, okay? And it would be hard to think that if you were alive at the time, we wouldn't be saying the same thing. Got to be careful about that. The motto, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. So this motto rings out over the entire country, and public opinion was very much in favor of going to war with Spain. It looked as if they had been the attackers, and we needed to, of course, punish them. The war really begins in May in the Philippines, so one of the largest of the Spanish colonies. And like I said at the beginning, this war will take place in two theaters. One is Cuba, one is the Philippines. The Philippines is primarily more of a naval action. There will be fighting on the islands, but most of the fighting is done on the water. And remember, America has just become the third strongest navy in the world, and they're going to utilize that navy right here. So, May 1st, 1898, one of the war heroes of the Spanish-American War, Admiral Dewey, he would enter Manila Bay, and man, do they take it to the Spanish fleet. You can look there in terms of manpower lost. The Spanish would lose 381 men. The United States won. Okay, and he would actually die of a heart attack on board one of the ships. This was a whooping. This was not even close to an equal battle. Now, once the Americans liberate the Philippines, once the people, the native Filipinos, understand that the Americans are here to kick the Spanish out, you had they were joining these 11,000 Americans to take the islands. By August, we made such moves, conquering the water, but then also the islands themselves, that the Spanish do surrender to the Americans, not to the Filipinos. And I'll tell you, we're going to stick around. The Filipinos think that we are there to help liberate them. It's not necessarily the case. We'll come back to that. Now, what's happening in Cuba? First step is we form a blockade. If you look at the map in the bottom right, you can see that the United States formed a blockade around Cuba, much like we would do in the 1960s as a precursor to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we will form a blockade around this island nation. No ships get in, no ships get out. But we quickly run into one of the problems, and that is we had focused so much on building up the Navy that we have completely forgotten to build up the Army. And frankly, we're not ready for this war. It came out of nowhere. And so the Army is running very low on supplies. Look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner. This was the standard uniform for someone fighting in Cuba at the time. That is a wool coat. All right? Now, I don't know how many of you guys have ever been to Disney World down in Orlando, Florida, in midsummer. It is hot. It is humid. Not time to put on your winter wool coat. And this is about 100 miles, well, more than that, probably about 300 miles south of there, where it's even hotter in Cuba. Very humid. I'm telling you, this is going to be a problem. You had 125,000 Americans that rushed to join the fight. After all, in the media, it was being painted as if, this was an action that we had been attacked out of nowhere, much like Pearl Harbor or 9/11. We needed to defend the United States. And by the way, a quick time out. An interesting note about the Spanish-American War is that this is really a moment in history where we're 30 years after the Civil War. This is actually the first unifying war that we have, and it really does do a lot. This is the first war that we've had since the Civil War, and in terms of unifying the North and South, it actually does do a lot to help revitalize some of that unified spirit in America. So, interesting note, we see that every time we are attacked. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, as I said, it does kind of unify us, but perhaps more important here just because of the proximity to the Civil War. Back to the notes. The supplies are going to be the biggest problem. Like I said, the heavy wool coats that they are given are not suitable for this climate. And, spoiler alert, by the end of the war, you're actually going to have more men die from disease and dehydration than you are Spanish bullets. Okay, so supplies are a very important thing, and in this war, it actually proves deadly, the fact that we had not prepared our military enough. There were many battles. The most important, we're going to talk about San Juan Hill on the next slide, but you had 17,000 troops that landed on the island. They were moving to one of the largest cities of Santiago. One of the most famous groups within that army were the men known as the Rough Riders, and they were headed up by Teddy Roosevelt himself. He when the USS Maine is attacked, he actually resigns from his basically Secretary of the Navy and joins the Army. Again, we talked about Roosevelt in our last unit. Very interesting guy. He was kind of your man's man. And here he sees an opportunity to become, frankly, a war hero, and he's willing to risk his life. He has a cushy Washington D.C. job where he's making pretty good money, sitting in a nice leather chair every day, and he resigns that to take over this group of the Rough Riders. This kind of ragtag group of men who, there was everything within this group. You had cowboys from out west, you had businessmen from out east, you had Native Americans that were part of this. It was a large group that would kind of emerge as kind of the one of the most unique characters we'll see in American military history. They did engage in one of the fiercest battles of the war, and one of the final battles, and that was the Battle of San Juan Hill. You had about 15,000 on the U.S. side that were pushing to take one of the last Spanish strongholds on top of this hill, and basically frontal assaults from all directions, and very deadly, the deadliest battle of the war. You can see there, the U.S. will lose 124, the Spanish will lose about 58. I should mention, the Industrial Revolution was starting to have its impact on military weapons, but it was not yet what we would see at the level of the Great War, of World War I. This is still, we're seeing kind of even weapons from the Civil War were being used here. So, going back to that, supplies being the biggest issue. The results of this, of course, American victory in Cuba and ultimately the war. But for Teddy Roosevelt himself, this would be what propels him to being a household name and eventually becoming President of the United States. As quickly as it started, it ended. America's quickest war. It only lasted 16 weeks, or about 4 months. I always like to remind you, you've been in school for about 4 months. So, to fight in an entire war in that period, this was something that had never been done and hasn't been done since. They sign a treaty with Spain in Paris. So the treaty is called the Treaty of Paris of 1898. There were about 300,000 Americans that did serve in this, and you had about 5,400 that would die and sacrifice their life for our country. But what's interesting, when you really start to analyze those numbers, only about 400 of those, 379 in particular, were dead due to battle. The rest are due to disease. So again, the lack of proper uniforms, the lack of supplies, really was the most deadly part of this war. The terms of the treaty. Cuba would become independent. We are not done there. We'll talk about America's role in Cuba. We will form what becomes known as basically a protectorate. The United States would receive, as a territory, Puerto Rico, Guam. Okay, so we will take over. We will assume those two. The U.S. will agree to pay $20 million for the Philippines. It was a vast, vast territory. The Philippines are at least hundreds of islands. And you have a tremendous amount of resources there. It was a huge colony. So partly why we do agree to pay partly for ownership of the Philippines. But remember, the Filipinos, they thought they were fighting for their independence. They're not going to be too happy once they realize that we cut a check to their colonial oppressors to replace them. So, next time we meet, we are going to talk about what America does to manage this empire. We've never been in this situation before. We've never had territories outside of our own borders that we had to control, and especially we're going to see part of the problem of having an empire and how costly, both in terms of money and blood, it'll be to maintain that empire. As always, guys, please feel free to email me if you have any questions, and look forward to seeing you next time.